So you're with your honey and you're making out when the phone rings. You answer it, and the voice is,
"What are you doing with my daughter?"
You tell your girl, and she say, "My dad is dead." Then, who was phone? At one point in time, that line was one of the most famous in creepypasta history. It was a meme, a joke, and a response to all things too spooky for you. Unfortunately, due to the decline in the popularity of creepypastas, and the fact that this pasta comes from the genre's earliest days, it's largely being forgotten. Now, as someone who still regularly quotes it anytime a phone rings in, well, anything horror related, I can't let that happen. At least without first celebrating it. So, here's the background of this infamous pasta. Creepypastas, the spooky cousin of copypastas, started to gain prominence in 2007. During the genre's first couple years, most of them originated and were spread via 4chan's paranormal board. X was created in early 2007, and in the years that followed served as a kinda hub for, well, this sort of stuff. There was of course works that predate it, but noticeably less, and the board's impact cannot be overstated. The roots of many foundational and staple pieces of late 2000s online horror can be sourced back to it, which is pretty freaking wild. We're talking everything from the SCP Foundation to Ben Drowned. Anywho, back in those days, the subgenres of creepypastas was a lot more ill-defined, so they tended to be categorized using 3 broader classifications. These were creepypasta, crappypasta, and trollpasta. Creepypasta was the most self-explanatory and was the categorization for anything scary and good. Think Russian sleep experiment or The Rake. Crappypasta, meanwhile, was a dismissive name and classification given to those creepypastas that tried and failed to be scary or even competent. These were the lower quality stories, the poorly written, formulaic AF, and generally crappy ones, though they were mostly sincere attempts. The original Jeff the Killer story is a great example of this, as well as sonic.exe from a few years later. And finally, you had the trollpastas. Now, trollpastas were the intentionally bad creepypastas. These were the stories that either skirted the line trying to pass themselves off as genuine creepypastas, or would go all in on their terribleness, making their troll and joke-like nature obvious to all other users, the latter of which being where Who Was Phone firmly lives. From its earliest posting in 2008, the pasta has always been so bad it's good, despite its artificial nature. After all, it's not genuinely bad, rather it's tongue-in-cheek and self-aware. The story itself is also pretty memeable, which is something that add-ons were more than happy to capitalize on. Paranormal's users could use the story to dunk on bad writing, dumb plot twists, or most commonly, could play along as if it was some sort of magnum opus of horror fiction. A joke that's persisted to this day. To get exactly why this happened, you first need to understand a little bit about image board culture, at least during that period. You see, each board within 4chan has its own specific culture and identity. They have their own communities, language, and memes. And whilst over time these ideas can disseminate to other boards and even the internet at large, much of it stays contained to the original board. It is, however, a two-way street, as 4chan itself still retains its own larger sense of identity and distinct set of values. Often, core parts of this overriding mentality can link through into the behaviour and actions of its users throughout its various boards. The long and short of it is this: 4chan has always embraced trolling and loved a good in-joke, which is what pushed this pasta to become such a meme within paranormal. And since that board was at the forefront of the birth of the genre, Its humour and memes naturally got adopted into the fledgling creepypasta community. Over time, the pasta would gain some notoriety online outside of its original niche. This is thanks to the communities of X and Creepypasta helping to spread it further, either by reposting it or creating media based off of it. Everything from comics and image macros to edits and videos were made. In fact, my original exposure to this pasta was through a dramatic reading of it uploaded all the way back in July of 2008.
Jesus, that makes my bones creak.
So there you have it. That's the background of Who Was Phone, one of the most famous and earliest known troll pastas. Whilst there isn't much to the story itself, it's an interesting window into the early days of creepypastas, a genre whose history is starting to vanish. Lack of archiving and preservation is unfortunately starting to become an issue, and it's a fate that most things online will ultimately suffer. Sure, it's not the biggest problem now since the more notable websites remain active, but the closure of smaller websites, the deletion of pages, and the patchy thread archiving of X during the late noughties is beginning to have an impact. Lesser known pastas will naturally slip through the cracks, and regardless of their quality, it's a sad end. Crappypasta.com, the sister website to Creepypasta.com and the largest repository for crappy and troll pastas, was shut down at some point in 2020, and with it, a huge chunk of the genre's history disappeared, even if you can still technically access it via the Wayback Machine. Time perhaps hasn't been the kindest to creepypastas, and whilst there's no doubt that both the internet and internet horror owes a lot to them, in many ways we've just moved on from them. Even so, just as I still adore many a creepypasta, the Who Was Phone troll pasta has a special place in my heart, if only because it's one hell of a time capsule to simpler times.